Okay, a warm welcome to everybody, especially those who are joining us for the first time. This is at the Study of Religions research seminar. Today we have one of our own, Dr. Rachel Woodlock, who is an assistant lecturer here in the Study of Religions, is going to present some of her work on Islamophobia. Rachel is an academic, a writer, and researches and teaches about Islam and Muslims. She co-edited the book on Fear of Muslims, International Perspectives on Islamophobia with Douglas Pratt. That was published by Springer in 2016. And it was an evidence-based examination of Islamophobia in both Old World Europe and the New World of America and Australia. She's also written an interesting book titled For God's Sake, An Atheist, a Jew, a Christian and a Muslim Debate Religion, which was published in 2013 by Pan Macmillan. And that discusses some of life's biggest questions. Rachel joined us in the department this year as an assistant lecturer, and she's going to talk a little bit about Islamophobia. And I think this is a really important discussion topic for us. You know, Islamophobia is a term which is kind of used and kind of understood and grappled with and accepted and rejected at so many different levels. And I think it's a subject that is really important, not just globally, but specifically here in Ireland. So I'm going to hand over to Rachel, who's going to present, and then hopefully we'll have some time for questions and discussion.
Okay, thank you, Aman. Okay, so I'm going to, fingers crossed, hope that my, can everyone see my slide, Fear of Muslims, Understanding Islamophobia?
Yeah.
Yeah, grand. Oh, good, okay. So, thank you very much for having me. I did most of my research and my work in Australia, so I'm starting to translate my understanding and my experiences into the Irish context. So what I thought I'd talk a little bit about today was Islamophobia as a concept, particularly because there is actually, I'm finding quite a difference between the Australian experience for Muslims and Irish experiences of life in Ireland being. And so I want to unpack a little bit about the meaning of the word Islamophobia. As the man mentioned, it's one of those words that kind of gets bandied about, and it means different things to different people. So I'll start off with this picture. So I was looking around. I actually had taken a picture of a photograph of, I live in Tipperary, and I'd taken a photograph of the planning centre permission, the planning permission notice that gets put up for the proposed Tipperary Islamic Cultural Centre that's going to be built in Clonmel. My husband and I were going for a little bit of a walk, and we thought we'd walk past the block of land with the old building that's on it currently. And there was something attached to the planning permission notice, and I took a little bit of a closer look, and it was actually the wrapper from a packet of bacon rashers. So someone had taken the time to attach this little rasher packet to the planning permission notice. And I took a photograph, and I took it down, and I debated about whether or not to say anything. And I thought, no, I won't say anything. But I can't find the photograph for the life of me because I wanted a little local something. But I found this one instead. And this is actually a photo that was taken from a website called Church Militant, in regard to the Eid prayers that were being held at Croke Park Stadium in August 2020. And a group of Catholics had been objecting to the Eid prayers. It was the first time that Eid prayers were held at Croke Park Stadium. And there were a number of banners protesting no Sharia in Ireland, Islam is evil. And they were also protesting that Archbishop Dermot Martin had been invited to and was participating in an interfaith, example of good interfaith relations, and they were very objecting to that as well. High-profile individuals such as journalist Gemma O'Doherty and other groups, including the Irish Freedom Party and the Alliance of Former Muslims of Ireland, objected to the GAA giving permission for the prayers to go ahead. And part of the justification of this is that they argued it was a slight on the memory of Irish civilians who were killed by the British. And quoted in another website, the liberal.ie, the of Former Muslims of Ireland said, "While the pitch of Ireland's largest stadium will soon be saturated in the blood of terrified animals, slaughtered with knives and blades without any form of sedation, just a century ago, the field of Croke Park was reddened by the blood of Irish civilians, gunned down by British forces during the War for Independence." And Dahi O'Sullivan, who is a candidate from the Irish Freedom Party, was quoted as saying that Croke Park itself has the blood of Irish martyrs killed by the British Army. It holds a special place for things Irish, which is exactly why the Muslims wanted this event to be held here, knowing well there were other suitable fields. It turns out that there were no plans to sacrifice animals on the stadium. There's this perception, I think, that was going around that it was going to be rivers of animal bloods flowing in Croke Park, and the reporters for Church Militant then had to go and retract that. So, sorry, the liberal.ie had to go and retract that, saying no, there was no plans and there wasn't any. But certainly I think we can agree the sentiments expressed here are not friendly to Islam and to Muslim practices. Do they express fear of Islam or Muslims? Reading between the lines, we can say there is a fear of a loss of pristine Irish authenticity, or the encroaching of Muslimness into Ireland and things Irish. But what makes Ireland Ireland and the Irish Irish will become diluted, infected, sullied by Islam and its followers. And the thrust of my talk today is going to be around this fear and antipathy towards the phenomenon that's become known as Islamophobia. And there's even a word in Asquelga, and please excuse my terrible Irish accent, Islamophobia. I really can't, I'm not very good with the Irish accent, but it's spelled I-O-S-L-A-M-A-F-O fodder, I-B-E. Before we get on to what Islamophobia does and doesn't mean, I'll just give you a very brief background to the history of the word itself. So antipathy towards Islam and Muslims has a very long heritage in the history of Christendom, in part fueled by dynastic conquest of formerly Christian territories by Muslims and by polemics developed by Christian apologists, even while positive encounters also occurred, whether through contact by Christian scholars in the great Muslim centres of learning, we're talking centuries ago here, in Baghdad and Andalus, and through good interreligious and trade relationships at various local levels, sometimes referred to in the Spanish experience as convivencia. I can't speak Spanish or Irish. However, historical moments of conflict, such as the Crusades launched by Pope Urban II to retake the Holy Land from the Turks, who were the enemies of God, has come to perception of Christian-Muslim relations, certainly historically and even today. And I'll move on to the next slide. Oops. Oh, there you go. I put it up there for spelling it. If anyone could do me a better pronunciation, I beg you, Jenny, Brendan, anyone. My daughter, who's learning Irish in school, just rolls her eyes and despairs. Okay, so what?
Sorry, Rachel, I think it's how you pronounced it. That's how I would say it as well, Islamophobia.
Islamophobia. Oh, good. Oh, good. I did practice it. Yeah, so it's obviously taken from the English word. Okay, so what we have here is William Blake's illustration of Muhammad pulling his chest open, as described in Dante's Divine Comedy. So themes of early anti-Islam and anti-Muslim polemics included the idea of Islam and Muhammad as a Christian heresy. And here it's Dante who puts Muhammad in the ninth ditch of Malibulge, the eighth realm of hell, designed for schismatics. And he was placed particularly amongst the sowers of religious discord. So he's split with his entrails hanging out because he's a heresiac. So an early polemic against Islam was the idea that it was a heresy, a Christian heresy. And Muhammad and Muslims were depicted as lascivious, as sexually promiscuous, overly indulgent in sensual pleasures, and also associated with violence, with military conquest and religious zeal. And I mean, I'm just doing a very quick potted history. So moving into, you know, with the rise of the Ottoman Empire, Islam and Muslims became subsumed under the label Turk. And this was at a time when European identity itself was evolving. We have here, this is Eugène Delacroix's The Fanatics of Tangier. So when the French took over and colonised Algeria, there was a movement of French, particularly into Northern Africa, and Delacroix actually witnessed some kind of strange ceremony in Tangiers, and he was scribbling down pictures and portraits and notes and developed portraits based on his artwork that he of scenes that he felt he saw. And this idea of the European attitude towards the Turk was depicting them as a military threat, but one in decline as the Ottoman Empire became the sick man of Europe. So Orientalist depictions of Muslims then described them as despotic, servile and effeminate, exotic, and they're women in need of rescue. And it is quite interesting that they are depicted as inherently unable to throw off the shackles of despotism. Because we're going to come to the sort of touch on this theme again in how Islamophobia is, or how Muslims are depicted in current discourse as a racialized group. And then this evolved in the 20th century into the idea of Samuel Huntington's clash of civilizations. So Samuel Huntington wasn't the only person to talk about this, but he's probably the best known. And this idea is, after the Cold War, future wars would be fought along civilizational cultural lines. And Huntington divided the world up into various cultures, which he felt were incompatible with Western liberal democracies. And the two biggest threats, he thought, were or are Asian communism and Islamism. And certainly after the events of 9/11, the clash thesis was confirmed as true in the minds of many politicians, pundits and journalists, and certainly in the rhetoric of the far right, including with terrorists like Anders Breivik. So they see this inherent clash between the monolithic, homogeneous world of Islam, of Islamdom, and Christendom or Western democracy. And the two are going to battle it out for political dominance. The problem with this vision of the world is that it doesn't capture the complexities of how globalization and localization affect various political conflicts. Nor does it really address the sheer heterogeneity of Muslims across the globe, including those living in Huntington's West, if you will. We think that the earliest use of the specific term Islamophobia was actually around about 1910, could have been earlier, but in 1910, Alain Quelian wrote a doctoral thesis using the word Islamophobia, in which he described it as prejudice against Islam has always been widespread among the people of Western and Christian civilization and still is. For some, the Muslim is the natural and irreconcilable enemy of the Christian and the European. But it wasn't really until the end of the 20th century and with the publication of the Runnymede Trust Report in 1997, Islamophobia, A Challenge for Us All, in which the term really came into prominence and has gained traction ever since. So the report was the output of a commission on British Muslims and Islamophobia, and it was funded by the Runnymede Trust, a British organisation that focuses on race equality. Now, they defined Islamophobia as the dread or hatred of Islam and therefore the fear and dislike of all Muslims. So that was the definition that they went for. But Islamophobia is often talked about, but not always well defined. So there is often a fear element. So for Said, for example, and I've got some authors here, but I'll just give a brief synopsis of how they're defining it. The phobia aspect of it is correct because there's an anxiety that the West will not retain its cultural, economic and military dominance. And so also too, Yahya Burt describes it as the fear of Muslim political agency. Another author writes it as the fear of the threat of Muslim political agency in the context of post-colonialism. So there's also a race element, and we're going to talk a little bit about that a little bit further along. So for Tariq Madood, it's a form of cultural racism in recognition of the fact that the target group, the Muslims, are identified in terms of their non-European descent, in terms of their not being white, and in terms of their perceived culture. So there's a race element. Another author, Tyra, describes it as a political expression of racism. There's also an ideological element to it. For Stephen Shee, Islamophobia is an ideological formation created by culture of tropes, analyses, beliefs that become facts, guiding government policies and social practices. It doesn't belong to one party. It's not Labor or Liberal. It's not Republican. It's not Democrat. It exists to promote political and economic goals, both domestically and foreign policy goals. Probably the most, I suppose, well thought out discussion of Islamophobia as a term is by the academic Chris Allen. And he argues that there are maybe Islamophobias. So there are overlaps with anti-Semitism because many of the tropes that arise in the discussion of Muslims are rejigging or restatements of older anti-Semitic tropes. There's racism and there's xenophobia, fear of the migrant, fear of the one who doesn't belong. But they're all shaped by local context, possibly drawn from historical legacy, but there has to be a specific Muslim or Islamness about it. Right, so, but there is a debate over the term. There are people who reject the notion that there is such a thing as Islamophobia, and you might recognise some of these names. They deny Islamophobia is real. They think of it as a buzzword used to stop legitimate criticism of Islam as a religious or political philosophy and the bad actions of Muslim actors. So that any acts of violence against Muslims, you know, can be dealt with through pre-existing race relation laws. There doesn't need to be any specific recognition of Islamophobia outside of pre-existing race hatred laws. So Polly Toynbee argues that race is something people cannot choose, and it defines nothing about them as people, but beliefs are what people choose to identify with. So you can choose to be a Muslim or you can choose not to be a Muslim, but you can't choose not to be black, for example. She argues that Islamophobia is a nonsense word. It's a word to just stop debate. And Richard Dawkins has stated similarly that race, and he uses the dictionary definition, is a limited group of people descended from a common ancestor. And you hear the phrase, Islam is not a race, when people are denying the existence of Islamophobia. So why isn't it useful to think of anti-Muslim sentiment as merely racism? You know, in a way it's true. Islam isn't a race. There's, you know, Muslims aren't from a single race. And apart from the fact that earlier definitions of racism based on biological or phenotype markers have, you know, been rejected largely by the scientific community, we still have a notion of race in our social construct. And Islam is overwhelmingly viewed as a non-white religion. It is the religion of the brown and the black man. And it's interesting, actually, some of the work that Car has done on Islamophobia in Ireland, talking to Irish converts, where some Irish converts report being told that they are traitors to being Irish. When they convert to Islam, they're leaving their Irishness behind. They're converting into a foreign religion that belongs to non-Irishness. So the idea is that Islam is non-white. So there is definitely an element of racism to this. When a Sikh is attacked by virtue of being mistaken for a Muslim, he's both a victim of racism. So any brown person can stand in for another one as they're the interchangeable brown other. And he's also a victim of Islamophobia in that his mistaken identity is that of the Muslim. And I'm going to try, how my time was. I've got a little video. If I've got time at the end, maybe I'll show it to you. But it's an interview with a Sikh politician in Canada who was attacked for being, or when I say attacked, verbally attacked, for being Muslim, because the clothes of the Sikh, which includes the turban that the men, particularly the men, wear, is often mistaken for by Islamophobes as being Muslim, even though the Sikhi is a completely independent religion to Islam. So, you know, and also the other thing that is a problem is that where, you know, Greek Orthodox priests who might be white, or a white convert with a hijab on who's been a victim of an Islamophobic attack, they're not covered by race relations precisely because they don't belong to the targeted races. But we remember too, I pointed out in the Orientalist view of Islam and Turks as being inherently effeminate and inherently unable to have enough, to generate enough civilizational power to move free from despotism. So this is the notion of Muslims being racialized, which is one of those sort of academic words, where the attributes that are given an inherent stigmatizing, inherent socially devalued attributes are associated with Muslimness. When an Islamophobe yells out "sand nigger" or "towel head," "ninja," or "go back to where you come from," they invoke racially negative stereotypes of what a Muslim is. Bosnian Muslims in the 1990s, like Jews in Nazi Germany, were not victims based on their theological beliefs. The ethnic cleanser, unlike the Inquisitor, wasted no time in finding out what people believed, if and how often they went to the mosque and so on. Their victims were racially identified as Muslims and subjected to the most extreme acts of violence and murder. But it's not enough to just rely on the idea of Islam as racism. So again, as I mentioned before, race relations legislation doesn't protect people who don't belong to ethnic minorities, such as Jews or Sikhs or members of racial groups, precisely because their religious identity isn't being considered as a racial identity for the purposes of racial legislation. So Islam and Muslims as categories are being created as a cultural race group that endows the member with an inherent stigmatizing inferiority. And that inferiority is based on degrees of distance from the universal white male. So it's precisely because Muslims are not like us, in Dawkins, for example, logic, that they're petrified in the pre-modern past, so petrified and stuck in the Stone Ages that they're not able to come up with people who can acquire Nobel Prizes. It's precisely because of this that they're coded as different and inferior. So the ideal position against which Muslims are posited is this Western notion, or the subject of the West, which is a conceptual ideal, really, than more a geographical idea. It's a melange of ancient Greek, Roman, and Christian philosophical, legal, and religious ideas, Germanic customs, Latin-based Western Christianity, the Renaissance, the Reformation and the Enlightenment, the American and French revolutions, and European colonialism. So this idea of the West is what Muslims are being positioned against. And in contradistinction, the archetypal images of Muslims are that they are the products that code them in inferently alien other, identified as Arab, Turk, Asian. Muslims were and still are depicted in Western mythology as exotic, violent, hypocritical, fanatical, hostile, strict, dirty, dishonest, backstabbing, duplicitous, medieval, past obsessed, despotic, passive, and ultimately evil. So I want to shift now to the conduits. I won't show the video because I don't think I've got time. The conduits and the products of Islamophobia. So there is this problem that we have in that Islamophobia doesn't come from just one source. So there are a number of conduits into developing this phenomena of Islamophobia. So there is the belief in the biologically determined inferiority, as I mentioned. There is the historical antipathy, so this notion that there is a historical conflict between Christendom and Islam, between that's exemplified by the Crusades, that there is this inherent conflict. And the privileging of white Christendom, so Judeo-Christianity, which is one of those phrases that doesn't mean very much to Jews and probably doesn't mean very much to knowledgeable Christians, but is used as a buzzword again to mean non-Muslim and sometimes non-secular. It's the privileging of this as the superior civilizational force. Certainly overseas military conflicts feeds into Islamophobia. And acts of global crisis events. So 9/11, so the not just overseas conflicts, I should add, also too, we have the Charlie Hebdo attacks, the stabbings in London and the London 7/7 bombings, but also conflicts involving Western powers in Muslim majority areas, whether it's Iraq or Afghanistan, and also conflicts, inter-Muslim conflicts, or conflicts between Muslims and non-Western societies. So in Myanmar, in China, this perception that there is a problem in the Muslim world. Coincidental antipathy is, in terms of this dislike and this notion that there is something wrong with things that are not Western or not Muslim. Non-Western or foreigners, brown people, they all sort of belong in this pot of not very niceness. And we also have, feeding into it, anti-religious secularism, and this is what we're seeing at the moment in France, where Muslims are being targeted in particular for as part of Macron's attempt to win over the support of the far right in the face of support being given to Le Pen's party. He's trying to recapture some of that ground. And it was a strategy that worked quite successfully for John Howard and the Liberals in Australia in the 90s and in the early part of the 21st century, where they moved to the right to undercut the moderate to far right anti-immigrant sentiment being expressed by our One Nation party. And so Muslims are being targeted specifically for their Muslimness, but also because they are a symbol in France of religiosity, of assertive religiosity. And France has a long history of laïcité and their secularism, which they're very careful about, whilst still privileging Christian expressions of religiosity. They're very nervous about resurgent religiosity. So these all fall into what feeds into Islamophobia. And so consequently, the output of that can be sort of seen in two areas. We have institutionalized discrimination. So you have discriminatory legislation, and this can be things like Trump's Muslim ban, where when he first came to office and he targeted immigrants or visitors to the states coming from a variety of different Muslim majority nations. You can have law enforcement profiling and surveillance, and every Muslim will tell you that they are always pulled out for the random search when they go through their screening, and it's particularly worse if you are brown-skinned. But your camera has moved and we can't see your face. Oh dear, sorry about that. I was just moving my slides a little bit so that I could see my notes. Yes, so so the law enforcement profiling and surveillance, It's quite interesting how often random being pulled over for random surveillance happens to Muslims. I remember one time actually, I made the mistake of going to Yemen, and I had a big Yemeni stamp in my passport because I was studying Arabic a couple of years ago. And from the moment I got that lovely Yemeni stamp in my passport, I never got an easy pass through customs anywhere. When I was in travelling through, we stopped over, I think, in Heathrow, and I remember lining up in the queues, and there was a few queues to, I think this was actually just to check into the plane. It wasn't even customs or border control. And the queues beside me were moving along at a relatively good pace, but mine was taking a long time. And I saw somebody disappear off with my passport. I think it took an hour all up. And I asked the lady behind the desk, what the problem was. And she said, well, we're having a problem with the computers at the moment. And I thought, well, given that the aisles either side of me seem to be having no problems with computers at the moment, and my passport has disappeared, I highly doubt that to be true. Came back with the passport an hour later, and yes, I was allowed to get on the board. And then when I landed in Cork, I have an Australian passport, which should allow me a 3-month entry visa. This was before I moved over to Ireland. I was married to my husband, and my daughter had an Australian passport, and no problem for her, no problem for my husband. When it came to me, he stamped my passport and gave me a bit of a grilling as to why I was coming in to visit. And instead of the perfunctory 3 months that every Australian gets, I got a special visa that allowed me a few weeks that we were planning to be in Ireland. So I do remember thinking to myself, I must get a new passport without a Yemeni stamp in it. But anyway, so enough of that little digression. So we have institutionalized discrimination reinforced by media tropes. And the media is one of the main conduits for both promoting and for generating Islamophobia, and for reinforcing the view both to the intended audience, which is the non-Muslim intended audience, but also to the unintended, perhaps, Muslim audience about the position of Muslims in society. There is a restriction on civil liberties. So, for example, where, again, the Muslim travel ban is a good example of that. It's much more difficult for Muslims to, for example, apply to have mosques built. We all know the problem for, getting mosques built and it's always to do with parking. It's always to do with, loud noises, or it's not zoned correctly. But the difficulty for Muslims to get mosques built is one that's well known. But then we shift on to individual experience. And this is where a lot of the research on Islamophobia has focused, because we can measure Islamophobia or the products of Islamophobia when it's experienced by individuals. That can be internalized victimhood, this notion that I do not belong in the society to which I've moved or the society to which I'm born. And this is where we do get that liminal position for some people. For some people, there's a very liminal position where for some people, and a small number of people, they will become marginalised and will become prey to jihadist notions of fighting against their oppressors. We get acts of discrimination. We had some tragic stories. I know in my research it was quite tragic, of people applying for jobs, and on their CV their name is Abdullah. And they're just unable to get a call back. They change their name to Andy, no problems, they get callbacks. Same with the old envelope experiment, where envelopes are dropped with a variety of different names, the return address obviously being the researchers, because they want to see how many people will pick up an envelope, with postage and everything, near the post box. How many will pick up the envelope and return the envelope? And they found, of course, that white names, depending on which society they're in, white names obviously get returned the most, Muslim names get returned the least. And harassment, whether it's verbal harassment, and then you get physical acts of physical violence against Muslims. So these are the products of Islamophobia that we can actually measure. And it's important to note too that sometimes where people will perceive an act to be an Islamophobic act, but the state will not necessarily recognise it as that. They will say, well, we don't know what was going on in the mind. It was probably racial. We don't have a specific notion that the person was attacking you for being Muslim, particularly where those attacks are things like hijabs being pulled off. So it's a physical act. There's not necessarily, you know, an Islamophobe is not going to come up and say, for the purposes of statistical analysis, what I am now going to do to you is going to be an act of Islamophobia. But what I want to end on, because I'm being, given the card of, wrong way, is this lovely picture by, again, the same prayer being held in Croke Park, which is a picture of a young lad waving an Irish flag in Croke Park. And I think that Ireland is going to be one of those really interesting places to study in the future, because it is a new Muslim community that is establishing itself here. And so far, as Dr. Carr has discussed, the state response has been one of relatively benign neglect. We don't have politicians drumming up anti-Muslim fervour in Ireland, and the few elements that have been shown to be Islamophobic in the public consciousness have usually been tamped down pretty quickly. So that's not to say it can't change, but I think Ireland has the potential for being the possibility for Ireland to show a positive way of addressing Islamophobia and for the successful integration of Muslims to Irish society. I'll leave it there, and I suppose that gives us a little bit of time for questions.
Thank you, Rachel. We'll now take some questions or any points for discussion, or you can post questions into the chat box as well.
Oh, good. I've summed it up perfectly. You know everything there is need to know. Or as one of my old lecturers used to say, what are your questions?
Could I ask a question then, Rachel? I mean, we've kind of got the problem. What's the solution?
It's difficult because if we talk about Ireland in a specific context, it differs depending on where you are, because what we're fortunate here in that we're not dominated by the Murdoch press, and so some of the actions and the activities or solutions to tackle Islamophobia, I think, are slightly different in focus. Certainly, it has to be tackled at a number of levels. At a state level, at an institutional level, part of that is promoting long-term social inclusion and promoting the notion that to be Irish is beyond quite a narrow definition of what Irish nationality is. There's Irish ethnicity and there's Irish nationality. And Irish nationality is something to which all people who are citizens here can belong. And if we can promote that as a long-term social inclusion goal, I think it's very important, while at the same time retaining the strong heritage of what we consider to be ancestral ethnic Irishness. There's sometimes a fear about multiculturalism that it will diminish the contribution of the majority. I prefer the term kaleido-culture, where all different cultures that are settling and making up a society all have little different twists of a kaleidoscope, and they all generate a beautiful picture. Now, there might be some stronger colours that come through. So if we say in terms of Irishness, you know, having the crack, you know, being, you know, a very welcoming people, or whatever that you think is the positive attributes of being Irish. But there's also these other strands and colours and twists coming in through now, which is coming in from different ethnic and religious groups. So that's at an institutional level. The government has to have strong programs of open, you know, kaleido-culture, as I like to call it. Certainly, in terms for young Muslims, it's getting them involved in as many different strands of civil society as we can, encouraging them to become involved in politics, in sport, in media. We need young Muslim journalists more than anything, because they are able to be able to counter narratives when they do crop up in media circles. So we can get young Muslims involved, and young Muslims involved in things like climate change activities. Partly because this also has a second benefit, not only of normalising Muslims, because you see Muslims as part of all the normal structures of society, but it also means that it brings young Muslims into contact with the wider Irish community. And if you've got young people who are coming together and say, addressing an issue like climate change, it's not about religion then. And so it gives them an ability to cooperate and work in an interfaith environment without religion always being the sole focus. And it gives them a sense of positive solidarity. So encouraging young Muslims to become involved in civil society is absolutely important. I think also too, addressing, we're very lucky here in that there doesn't seem to be a strong marginalised element in the Muslim community for whatever reason. I think historically, because some of the migration moves into Ireland was largely from the middle educated classes. So we had a lot of doctors, for example, that migrated into Ireland in the 20th century. We're now starting to get obviously new populations of asylum seekers and so on. But generally speaking, we have Irish Muslims have been able to well integrate into society as they've moved in here. So we don't have a large marginalised population, which I think is really important. And absolutely, we know what feeds into marginalisation is things like blocked progress, about young Muslims feeling that they cannot succeed, they can't get jobs because of their name or their ethnicity or their religion. That they are somehow excluded as being not Irish or different. And these things that feed into marginalisation, which then feeds into fundamentalist rhetoric, which then builds into this clash narrative. But we don't have that here in Ireland. So I don't think, there are some, obviously we had Lisa, I can't think of her name, the convert who converted and went over and fought for ISIS, or was a jihadi bride for ISIS. And I think also to Terry Khalidi, I think there was an Irish terrorist, but by and large these are exceptions that prove the rule. I think, to sum it up, I think that's probably what I would suggest is how we attack Islamophobia.
Thank you. Jenny.
So thanks for your presentation, Rachel. I was thinking about what you were saying about Muslims, obviously not being all the same race or the same ethnicity, and then, the legal protection having to be about the religion. And I wonder, is there a resistance in Ireland about that? The protection of a religious worldview or practice, or particular religions, or even all religions, because the blasphemy, there was the Blasphemy Act that was repealed, which, in theory protected different religions from defamatory statements and hate, but I mean, it's obviously privileging Judeo-Christian, really Christian, with even the word blasphemy. I just the way the whole discourse around that in Ireland, I wonder, is there a resistance, and the whole history with the church and state here, I wonder, is that a factor, rather than it's not an unwillingness to protect people, but maybe just the type of legislation?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I would personally be quite wary to go down the route of, sort of the theoretical protection of Islam as a religion, as opposed to recognising the existence of Muslim as a category that can be the target of hate acts. So there is a difference, but I would absolutely see there would be quite a historical reason for kind of a resistance to the problem of things like blasphemy laws and so on, because of the particular unique experience in Ireland. Yeah.
Thank you. Is it Mia? Have I said your name correctly, Mia?
Yes. I was just sort of curious to perhaps also just raise something that's arising for me on kind of considering of the solution. And I'm wondering about whether we also need to consider that not all work needs to be on, for example, Muslim people integrating or adapting and fitting in, and whether there's some link here to white supremacy, white supremacist ideology, the sort of privileging and the sort of a sense of superiority as whiteness and as kind of white religions, if you like, or white dominant religions being more acceptable, etc., etc. And I think with kind of Black Lives Matter and so on and so forth as well, I think maybe this is highlighted, that huge amount of work that is needed from also white people who are actually not the majority of the population of the whole world, but often act as if they are, and that others are minority, to actually look at how we address these ideologies that have made the world the way it is, and try and undo some of it.
Yes, absolutely. That notion that, again, that it's whiteness against which Muslimness is posited, and it's white, and there's a lot of literature about the notion of assimilation versus integration versus isolation, and this notion that somehow immigrants, and in this case Muslim, but it's certainly absolutely not just Muslims. I just happen to focus on that particular area, but this type of rhetoric occurs for, you know, I mean, this is what's so interesting to me, is because I'm an immigrant. I'm Australian, but I'm an immigrant. But except for if I didn't have my hijab on, I wouldn't be perceived as an immigrant. Do you see what I mean? So because Australians and Brits belong in a special characteristic that's different from, say, if you're a Somali immigrant to Ireland, or an Afghan immigrant. So there's this expectation that immigrants need to somehow assimilate or adapt themselves. But we know from the way that societies work that there is a mutual adaptation. There always has been and there always will be. And I absolutely agree, we need to interrogate some of these expectations. I'm interested in Muslims moving as relatively new groups or into areas where they haven't necessarily historically been situated, because there's parts of Europe which have long, centuries-old historical Muslim communities. So we can't even say that Europe isn't Muslim. But I'm quite interested in this group, and it's certainly this group that is expected to somehow adapt or to change. But we know, and this is why I get back to kaleidoculture, that it's a mutual changing and a mutual adaptation that we need to be looking at. And I always want to say too, that doesn't mean to denigrate the I don't like to use the word host culture or the majority culture, but I know it's a thing in Australia where there's, and I'm sure it probably would crop up in some of the rhetoric from the sort of the more right-wing Irish groups, that they fear the loss of some kind of pristineness from Irish identity or Australian identity. There is a real fear that somehow that's going to be lost. But that actually doesn't accord with reality, with how group societies, evolve and change and adapt and take in elements of this culture and that culture, this language and that. Like, it's much more porous and much more multifaceted. But at the same time, I think we need to recognise and that it's this is why Muslims banning Christmas thing. I can't bear it, because it the idea that somehow in order to make space for Muslims, Christians should have to give up Christmas in some fashion, I think is wrong. I think it's absolutely wrong. We just need to have a space where we can recognise both.
Excellent. Any other questions or comments?
My headphones are about to go.
Thank you very much, Rachel, and thank you everybody for attending, and we will see you another time. Have a good evening. Bye just now.
Thanks, Rachel.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks, Rachel. Wonderful listening to you.